Hello BookTube, this is my weekly reading vlog for the week of April 18. As usual, I have about 10 books on my shelf that I've started reading and not finished, but for this week in particular, I've only been working on 3 books. They were the same 3 as last week. The Merry Adventures of Robin Hood by Howard Pyle. The Hand of Oberon by Roger Zelazny, part of the Chronicles of Amber series. And Chomsky's Universal Grammar, an Introduction by V.J. Cook and Mark Newsome. Obviously this last one is a little bit of a different genre than the other two, so I don't know who this video is for necessarily, other than for me, to just chronicle what I've been reading. So it's not been a great week in terms of reading for me. I've been busy at work. I've had a few deadlines. And, you know, the thing about deadlines is it's not always the work itself. It's the deadline looming over you. Because I'm one of those people who will stress out about the deadline all week and then just do it all at the last minute. But the fact that I was stressing out about it all week did impact the amount of time I felt like I was comfortable devoting to leisure reading, or professional development reading, as the case may be. So I'll say a few words about each of the books. The Hand of Oberon by Roger Zelazny, I have really been enjoying. This week I read from page 580 to page 614. Now that 580, these page numbers is because this book is included in part of a compendium volume which has all 5 works of the Chronicles of Amber. But anyways, I've really been enjoying it. So many surprises, so much plot being developed, so much changes of allegiances or things being revealed or puzzle pieces falling into place. I'm hesitant to talk about it because I really don't know what I can say about it that won't be... At this point, you know, this is the book 4 out of 5 with a fairly complex plot. It's going to sound just like gibberish to anyone who's not familiar with the books, and anyone who is familiar with the books, it's just going to sound like spoilers or recounting parts of the book that you've already read. That being said, I'm going to dive into this a little bit anyways. There are a couple of thoughts that strike me. One is that, and this is the same complaint I always have, but I really enjoy the plot sections of this book, these books, talking about the whole series. But the parts where they travel through shadow always strikes me as a little bit weird, and I know it's supposed to be kind of poetic, but I have a hard time focusing on those sections without my eyes glazing over. But I'm afraid to let my eyes glaze over because I'm afraid I'm going to miss some substantial plot point. But especially now, at this point in the series, 4 books in, I feel like, okay, I know it's really weird when he travels through shadow. Do we need to do this again with another page and a half of description, like emerging on the farther side? There is no rain, the air is still, the sky smoothed and darkened to a proper star-filled black. Meteors cut and burn, categorizing to after-image scars, fading, fading. Moons cast like a handful of coins, 3 bright dimes, a dull quarter, a pair of pennies, one of them tarnished and scarred. Down then, that long winding way. Hoof clops clear and metallic in the night air. Somewhere, a cat-like cough. A dark shape crossing a lesser moon, ragged and swift. Downward, the land drops away at either hand. Darkness below, etc. That's actually just one paragraph of what goes on for 3 pages about. And essentially what's going on here is he's traveling through parallel universes, and he's able to alter the details of each universe slightly to allow him into the next universe. But every time in the series a character does this, it seems like we have to have a page and a half of this really expressionist writing, which I have a hard time focusing on. Reading it out loud just now actually wasn't so bad, because the act of reading it aloud forces me to focus on the prose more. But when I'm actually just trying to read this silently, I have a hard time absorbing it. There are a couple more things about the plot which I'm not entirely sure make sense. I mean, the allegiances are changing so much, but it does make you wonder if it's a classic thing where a character comes out and they say, oh, it turns out I was on your side all along. And it's like, oh, okay, well, then why did you do all these other things beforehand? Or why were you acting so sketchy beforehand? It kind of makes sense, but it kind of doesn't. It might be counted as a plot hole if you were inclined to be ungenerous. And that's all I'm going to say about the Hand of Oberon for now. Moving on to the New Adventures of Robin Hood by Howard Pyle. So I made about 20 pages headway in this. 26 pages, I think. So this is the part in the Robin Hood legend where Ellen Adale, the famous minstrel, has just entered the story. Ellen Adale's true love is going to marry another person, and they need to track down a friar who's going to help them, which turns out to be Friar Tuck. And there's a story about when Robin Hood and Friar Tuck first meet, where Robin Hood gets Friar Tuck to carry him across the river, and then Friar Tuck steals Robin Hood's sword and said, now you have to carry me back across the river. And then they do, and then Robin Hood steals the swords, and he says, okay, now you have to carry me back across the river. And then halfway through the river, Friar Tuck dumps Robin into the water, and then they have a big fight with the swords until the rest of the merry men show up. Which is something I couldn't have told you about last week. If you would have asked me last week, how did Friar Tuck join up with Robin Hood? I would have been like, I don't know. But then once I read that did seem vaguely familiar. I'd read that story somewhere before as a child. It was in the back of my brain somewhere. What does strike me about this book, though, and I suspect this is a problem inherited over from the source material, the old ballads, is just how repetitive in structure it is. So most of this book, at least half of this easily so far, is just new people joining Robin Hood's band. So the story is not so much about the deeds that Robin Hood's merry men are doing. It's just a story of how this person entered the group, and then how this person entered the group. And it's all pretty much the same story. Robin Hood encounters them. Robin Hood acts a little bit cocky and gets into a fight. They have a big fight, and at the end of the fight, Robin Hood says, okay, let's stop fighting. You're way too good of a fighter. I really like you. Why don't you join my band? And that story has repeated itself over so many times within here. Little John, the Tinker, Midge the Miller, Will Scarlet, who actually was Robin Hood's nephew, but Robin Hood didn't recognize him, so they still had that fight. The Wrestler, some other characters whose names I've forgotten. It's a very repetitive story frame. That being said, though, I don't know. It's not without its charms. I'm still kind of enjoying this book. The other thing I've been noticing is this is a book, it's explicitly for children. But they keep talking all throughout this book about how wonderful alcohol is. You know, how, you can, everybody's always happy when you're drinking ale, or, good ale, or marmset or all these different things that they were drinking back then. It strikes me a bit strange to be in a children's book for maybe a couple reasons, depending on what your ideological bent is. You could easily take the puritanical objection and say, shouldn't be teaching children that alcohol is fun. I'm sure somebody would have that objection. But the other thing is, even as a kid, it struck me a bit strange to have these children's stories where drinking was such a big part of it. Because it just seemed like a tease. Because, when you're a kid, you're not allowed to drink anyways. So why do adults put in all these things about how wonderful alcohol is in a kid's story? Isn't that a little bit cruel when the target audience can't drink, and many of them have never drunken anything in their life, and they're not allowed to drink? It just seems a little bit silly to put that in, and then you're like, well, kid, sorry, you can't drink until you're 21. Now, this book was published in 1883, so it wasn't 21 at the time, I'm sure. Or was it? When did we get that 21 thing? But the other thing I wonder, going back to 1883, is I think attitudes towards alcohol in America have gone through a number of cycles. And I say in America because I suspect in France or in Russia or maybe in other European countries, perhaps attitudes towards alcohol have remained relatively steady over the centuries, meaning it's just a part of the culture and it's totally normal and everybody loves it. But in America, I think we've gone through cycles where it's become completely normalized, and then cycles where it's become a bit, villainized. The most obvious example, of course, is Prohibition. But I think we've gone through cycles. I mean, I think when I was a kid, I definitely got the impression that drinking a lot of alcohol was not something that good adults do. And there was that whole Mothers Against Drunk Driving. And, yeah, it got tied in with that drunk driving campaign. But there was definitely a bit of an anti-alcohol vibe going on, I think. Which I think kind of goes in cycles throughout American history. So I'm not sure what things were like in 1883 when he wrote this book. But, well, who knows, huh? Because it's an American author who was living in England, and it was based off of old ballads, so it's probably a losing game trying to tease out where these attitudes are from exactly. So I'll just leave it at that. Okay, shifting gears completely and moving towards professional development. I read 12 pages of Chomsky's Universal Grammar from page 78 to page 80. Now, this is all part of chapter 3. And as I've mentioned before, I'm on my second reading of this book. I did actually finish the whole thing off in December, but decided I was going to review sections of it before I attempted a full book review on the weblog. So on my second reading of it, the first time I read this book, I was understanding most of it. I would make notes in the margins, but for the most part I was understanding most of it relatively well up until chapter 4. And then chapter 4, just my level of understanding just dropped off. In chapters 4, 5, 6, 7, and 9, and to a certain extent 8, I was just struggling with. I was reading the words, but I wasn't really comprehending it. Chapter 3, though, chapters 1, 2, and 3 were still okay, and these are long chapters. So by the time you finish chapter 3, it's page 132. So it's about a third of the book, the first 3 chapters. And chapter 3, what I was reading this week, is General Concepts of Language Acquisition. How we learn our first language, according to Chomsky, and then how we learn our second language, although I haven't gotten that far this week. So, yes, if you're at all familiar with Chomsky's theories, Chomsky has this idea that grammar is inherent. It's something we're born with as part of our biological heritage. We're born with the capacity for grammar. We need some exposure to the language, but we don't actually need to learn the grammar. We're born with grammar pre-programmed into us. And it talks about Chomsky's theory in this way. It says that Chomsky has put the problem of language acquisition as a black box problem. And that surprised me slightly when I read it, because when I was studying this at university, I remember the professor mentioned Chomsky's theories. And he said in a way that I interpreted as being somewhat dismissive or derisive. He said, oh, it's kind of a black box thing. Nobody really knows what's going on inside the mind. So I was a bit surprised to see that the metaphor of the black box actually comes from Chomsky himself. That's Chomsky's metaphor. So the metaphor of the black box is that you know what's going in to the mind, the language input that the child is exposed to. You know what's coming out, which is the output or the grammar that the child acquires. And then you have to make inferences about what's going on in the mind from the input the child is receiving to the output the child is producing, without actually being able to open up the mind and look at the brain itself. So it's a black box. The other metaphor they use, and I think this is the second one is the metaphor of the authors here, V.J. Cook and Mark Newsom, rather than Chomsky. But they compare it to a Scotch distillery. So you see barley and empty bottles going in one door, and then you see Scotch whiskey coming out the other door, and then based on what's going in and what's going out, you have to decide yourself what the process must be inside that distillery to produce a Scotch whiskey from the barley and the empty bottles. There was a little thing I made a note of here where they say linguistic competence in a language, i.e. generative grammar. Is it pronounced generative or generative? I think generative. Generative grammar. Now, I made a little note here in the margins, because that confused me slightly, because earlier in the book, the authors had said something which also confused me. They talked about the idea of generative grammar, and they said a lot of people hear generative grammar, and they think that this means that it's the ability to generate sentences. But apparently that's not what generative grammar means at all, even though that's what it seems like it would mean, right? Generate. But apparently generative grammar, again, according to the authors here, means a formal and explicit description of grammar. So what does a formal and explicit description mean? Well, I don't really know. They didn't define that very well, actually, in this book. But they even mentioned something called the generative gaffe, is I believe the name for it, which is when somebody is using the term generative grammar as a way to describe the productive capability of somebody's grammar, the ability to generate new sentences. If somebody's using the word generative grammar to refer to that, they're actually using the term wrong. And this is apparently a thing that even linguists do all the time. And I actually Googled this after I read the term generative gaffe. And apparently it's something that people in my profession applied linguistics or TEFL teachers who go into linguistics have been accused of making the generative gaffe, where they mistake the word generative meaning for productive grammar. But then after saying that, says they acquire linguistic competence in the language, i.e. a generative grammar. And I thought generative means a formal and explicit description of the grammar. So what does it mean when it says here a generative grammar? I don't understand what that means. Or it seems that the authors are using the description of the word in a way that they said they weren't going to use it. I don't know. Then they go through here a history of universal grammar, somewhat, different stages of it. Actually, sorry, that's not really fair. They allude briefly to a complicated history with universal grammar, but then they do their best to skim over it. It's one of the things I vaguely knew about before reading this book, but appreciate much more after having read this book, is that Chomsky's theories have gone through so much evolution that it makes it difficult to understand or difficult to get into as a newcomer, because he's constantly referencing back, saying, okay, in the 1960s, Chomsky thought this, but then it evolved into the 1970s when they thought this, and that changed in the 1980s, and there are major changes going on in the theory. But to make sense of the terminology, you almost need to know all that history of all the different evolutions the theory went through. And not just Chomsky, but the whole school of linguists associated with Chomsky, apparently. But they talk about, well, okay. They talk about how there's the input, and then this gets processed by universal grammar, and then it comes out with the output. And then they come to the famous poverty of the stimulus argument, which is one of the more famous terms associated with Chomsky, and hopefully I can describe this adequately. Poverty of the stimulus is Chomsky's argument that based on the linguistic input that a child gets, there's no way that a child could acquire the grammatical competence that they ultimately acquire. In other words, the stimulus or the input is impoverished so that the poverty of the stimulus, there's not enough information in the input that the child gets to acquire grammatical competence. And this doesn't seem obvious at first until you get into some of the complex grammatical transformations that native speakers appear to do subconsciously, in which they've gone into in this book. And the most prominent example they've been using in this book, and I believe Chomsky's favorite example generally, is the structural dependency. So the example, the man who is tall is happy. If you want to make a question, you move the auxiliary verb from the verb phrase and not from the noun phrase. So the who is tall, you leave that is alone because that's part of the noun phrase. You move the verb phrase is to the beginning of the sentence. Is the man who is tall happy? And Chomsky has argued that this and other grammatical transformations, there's no way the child could pick that up simply from the input. I mean, where do they ever hear a sentence like, is the man who is tall happy? Outside of linguistic books, those specific sentences are relatively rare, but the child still picks up the idea that the auxiliary verb in the verb phrase and not in the noun phrase gets moved to the front to make a question. The other thing that they make a big deal of here is that the child doesn't receive correction. So they don't have a native speaker child, you know, a 2-year-old growing up in a natural environment, does not receive any instruction on what kind of transformations are permissible or not permissible. So they have to acquire it all from positive evidence without getting any feedback on what transformations are not permissible, which doesn't seem likely. Hopefully I'm doing a good job of describing that. In case I'm not, maybe I'll just read the summary that's here in the book. They break down the poverty of the stimulus argument into 4 steps. They said, a native speaker of a particular language knows a particular aspect of syntax. For example, the structural dependency that I was just talking about. Step 2, this aspect of syntax could not have been acquired from the language input typically available to children. Therefore, step 3, this aspect of syntax is not learned from outside. And therefore, step 4, this aspect of syntax is built into the mind. So it's part of our genetic inheritance that we have structural dependency. They call this in the book Plato's problem. Apparently Plato also had written about this problem. Now, one thing I wrote in the margins, because it wasn't clear here, is was Plato specifically talking about linguistic knowledge? Or was he talking about some other kind of knowledge? But apparently Plato also explored the problem of how do we know what we know. And they said Plato's solution was to say that it originated from memories of prior existence. Possibly, I don't know, but obviously scientists don't put a lot of stock into reincarnation. So Chomsky's is to invoke the innate properties of the mind. There are some things in this book which perhaps are not made terribly clear, but which are clear in another book, which is The Language Instinct by Steven Pinker. And by the way, if you are looking for a very simple explanation of Chomsky's theories, don't read this book. This book will really do your head in, especially the later chapters. But go ahead and get The Language Instinct by Steven Pinker. That's a much simpler explanation. But something Steven Pinker makes clear in that book is he says, white middle-class families will often have babies who will get all sorts of linguistic attention. You know, they talk to the baby, they correct the baby, they encourage the baby to talk. And so sometimes people get the mistaken idea that the parents are actually teaching the language to the children through all that baby talk and through all that conversation and through all that repetition. But Steven Pinker says that's actually not how all babies or all cultures operate. He says there are a number of cultures where, you know, the mother is busy all day. So the baby is just kind of left sitting in the chair all day and nobody pays it any attention. And those babies still learn how to talk just like every child learns their own native language. And so that's something that's not quite explicitly made clear in this book, but I think that's another component maybe of the poverty of the stimulus argument. Now, this is supplemented by what they call the lexical learning hypothesis. And then this is what I was talking about in the video last week, where each word has its own grammar. So, for example, give is a verb that requires a subject, an object, and an indirect object. Sleep is a verb which requires only a subject. So, in addition to learning the grammar of the language, the child is also acquiring the grammar of all the different words.